Hello, and welcome to the first webinar of the year for the Food and Water Futures program of the Stretton Institute for Public Policy at the University of Adelaide. My name is Georgina Drew, and I am the program co-director along with Professor Sean Connell, who's in evolutionary and biological sciences. Today, we've gathered for a stellar panel of water experts, each with a range of skills and insights developed from research undertaken in locations around the world. The theme that brings us together is state successes and failures in addressing water insecurity, policy perspectives. I've convened this set of panelists because of their extensive knowledge on the topic, and also because we've been part of a recent Water International Journal special issue focusing on water insecurity in the state. So for today's discussion, 7 panelists will share their insights based on scholarly work done in Brazil, India, Indonesia, Puerto Rico, South Africa, and the USA, amongst other locations that I'm sure will come up. And some of you as audience members, when we get to the more open-ended discussion, might have different examples to raise for our discussion. So for us today, this panel is an opportunity to cross-pollinate some of our research and to focus upon the policy implications of the author's empirical and conceptual insights. I think you would agree that it's rather rare to have an opportunity to reflect upon the collective contributions of such a wide range of scholars working in such diverse parts of the world. So I thank everyone for supporting this effort, including the people who've tuned in as audience members today. It merits noting that some of the panelists are community members of HY's RCN, which is the Household Water Insecurity Experiences Research Coordination Network. That's funded by the NSF, the National Science Foundation, and it's building a network of cutting-edge research on household-level water insecurity experiences that can help improve social practice and, you guessed it, policy. So since HY's aims to build water research networks and to encourage transdisciplinary work in the field, there are ways to self-nominate and become a member, as I recently did myself. So I'd encourage you all to look at the HY's website for more details. And if it allows, when people are discussing, I might I'll put some of the URLs up in the chat box. But it's here that I should mention that Wendy Jepson, Amber Wutich, Vanessa Lucena Pinocchi, and Pedro Roberto Jacobi helped to coordinate the Water International Special Issue, which I also believe was an effort that grew out of HY's programming. So the format for today will primarily involve lots of short bursts of commentary and discussion, followed by a roundtable conversation and a Q&A. With 7 panelists, as you can imagine, and with the aim of getting to the policy end of the stick, we have a fair amount of ground to cover. So to help organize the discussion, I've asked the panelists to speak alphabetically by first name. What we'll do is we'll have a first round of each panelist self-introduce and speak for roughly 2 minutes about how their research helps us understand water insecurity based on their particular case study. Then we'll do a round robin section to speak to the policy successes and failures that panelists have come across in their field sites, including what are councils, municipalities, and states getting right, where are things going wrong, and why? And then this will finally morph into a roundtable format that focuses even more on policy implications, thinking about how these successes and failures that we're going to discuss might help us address water insecurity in ways that informs local, regional, and state policy infrastructures. And then that will finally lead into a Q&A session. So that's the general guideline. Since we're following the first name alphabetical order, our initial lineup will be Professor Amber Wutich, Melissa Beresford, Nicole J. Wilson, Rachel Arsenault, hopefully I'm saying that right, Sarah T. Romano, Suya Kingsley, sorry, I should have double checked on the pronunciations, Thomas Lavanchi, and Vanessa Pinocchi. So without further ado, I'll ask Amber to take it away with a brief self-introduction and overview of her project insights on water insecurity.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Amber Wutich, and I am a President's Professor of Anthropology at Arizona State University in the United States. I am also the Director of the Center for Global Health, and I direct an action for water equity, large National Science Foundation convergence grants. So the first opener that I wanted to give was to acknowledge the enormous role of HY's in getting this launched. Part of some of the people who are involved are here today, others are not. So those who are in the audience, thank you. A little background about how this special issue came together is that HY's had been invited by the Chinese Academy of Sciences to present a series of talks. And Wendy Jepson organized that, and I delivered the keynote. And so the editor of Water International was in the audience. and Dr. Nickham invited us to put together a special issue. We began to do that, and then at the same time, because Wendy is in deep conversation with her colleagues in Brazil, I believe she and Dr. Pinocchi had been talking and realized that there were wonderful synergies between the special issue that Dr. Pinocchi was leading and the one that Wendy was leading, and our issues were married and came together. So I would love for Dr. Pinocchi to speak a bit as well about how, the part that she led came together, because that's a history I don't know. So now, with the rest of my 2 or so minutes, I would like to tell you about the paper that I'm here to present, which is a paper that was led by Dr. Anais Roque, who wanted very much to be here but couldn't be. This is a paper that looks at water sharing in a context that has never been examined before, in a post-disaster context. She led our team in working on Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and she went and collected all of it. Dr. Anais Roque. She is a wonderful early career scholar, but also was a shelter administrator, Maria. So she had incredible insights on how people managed the hurricane, participant observation. She went back and led us in a 3-site study, a rural, peri-urban, and urban site that used qualitative and mixed social network methods. So she elicited egocentric social networks from about 30 respondents in each of the 3 sites to understand how they conducted water sharing in the wake of Hurricane Maria. And as in many other contexts, she found it to be common, necessary to survival, but also very logistically difficult and emotionally intense. That paper analyzes water sharing in sort of a framework of autogestión, which is a Spanish word that describes self-management. There are sort of 2 ways of thinking about autogestión. One is that it is sort of like a radical, community-led, ground-up way of providing essential resources. The other is that it's a kind of like neoliberal marginalization and bootstrapping. And the analysis that Dr. Roque led indicates that this post-disaster context in Puerto Rico really aligns more with this sort of neoliberal exploitation model of autogestión. And it points to ways in which projected future complex and cascading disasters really are complicated by an autogestión response. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amber, for that. And in the interest of time, I'll just ask everyone to just go ahead and pipe up with your presentation after the last person spoke. So next we have Melissa Beresford, then it's Nicole, Rachel, Sarah, who's just joined us. Hi, Sarah, Suya, Thomas, and then Vanessa. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Beresford. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks, Gina, for organizing. I'm an economic anthropologist at San Jose State University in California. So the paper that I'll be talking about today is a paper that was led by Alex Brewis, and also Dr. Katie Meehan was on this paper, and Amber Wooditch as well. The paper is looking at the process of elite capture in Phoenix, Arizona. So elite capture is this process through which elite populations mobilize discourses of public decay to kind of redirect funds and municipal works towards their own goals. So things that are meant for broader populations, elites, redirect that for their own purposes. So we knew that this process, we know that this happens, but we were really interested in kind of culturally how this process might be happening around municipal tap water. So how elite populations might be mobilizing discourses of public decay of municipal tap water to their own benefit. So we looked at cultural models of how people were thinking about municipal tap water, and we were really interested to see if kind of there were shared cultural models around tap water that might align with different social positions in society. So we looked at 4 urban neighborhoods in Phoenix, Arizona, an elite urban neighborhood and a low-income urban neighborhood, and an elite rural neighborhood, and a low-income rural neighborhood. We used a series of vignettes and cognitive anthropological methods to have people rank prestige of different types of water. So from bottled water, water treated with nanotechnology, reverse osmosis water, self-harvested rainwater. to tell us what they thought were the most prestigious types of water and what they thought were kind of low prestige and devalued types of water. So we found some really clear cultural models of the way that people thought about water, including a model that we called the elite anti-tap model, which was that people basically consistently ranked like Fiji water and brand name bottled water as very high and municipal inner city water as very low. And we also found that this elite anti-tap model by far mapped most clearly onto high socioeconomic status populations. So we really see this as kind of like the cultural underpinnings of this elite capture process in which elite populations are kind of mobilizing these rhetorics. There was also an interesting contradiction in that these elite populations who held these cultural ideas that tap water was dirty and not prestigious, overwhelmingly relied on municipal tap water themselves. And so we think that this is a really important process to be paying attention to, of ways that discourses are being mobilized so that elite populations can justify not upgrading infrastructures and having justification for relying more on bottled water, especially for low-income populations.
I'm next, but I'm going to hand it to Rachel.
Thank you, Nicole. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Rachel Arsenault, and I'm a second-year PhD student at York University in Toronto. It's a pleasure to join you all here today and to participate in this panel discussion. And although I've collaborated on several papers and written a few articles myself, I would like to discuss the article that I collaborated on with Nicole Wilson, who's going to be going right after me. And our colleagues from the Navajo Nation, Teresa Montoya and Andrew Curley. So in 2020, the four of us came together to draft an article that we called Governing Water Insecurity, Navigating Indigenous Water Rights and Regulatory Politics in Settler Colonial States. So when we began the research for this article, we realized that there are many parallels between the injustices experienced by racialized and marginalized populations and Indigenous peoples. However, for Indigenous peoples, their water insecurity is shaped by settler colonialism. At the time we wrote this paper, there were 57 long-term drinking water advisories in 39 First Nation communities. And currently, the Canadian government is reporting 37 long-term drinking water advisories in 29 communities. In the article that we collaborated on, we discussed, a First Nation in Canada as a case study on both the duration and impact that water insecurity has had on this community. So in 1919, a provincial government isolated the community of Shoal Lake by effectively making it into a man-made island in order to build an aqueduct, which would supply the city of Winnipeg with water. And while Winnipeg was able to draw clean and potable drinking water from this supply, the First Nation community suffered dire consequences. So this community, which had already been isolated because it was not connected to the Trans-Canada Highway and then had to rely on water transportation for supplies, was severely impacted, and their ability to build essential infrastructure such as water treatment plants and schools was obviously hindered. And it wasn't until 100 years later in 2019 that this issue was resolved for the community when they were finally connected to the Trans-Canada Highway. And for our discussion on how colonialism has impacted water insecurity for Indigenous peoples in Canada and the US, we hypothesized that colonial understandings of sovereignty and jurisdiction assume that governments have the final authority over territories, and that colonial mindsets, which do not share the same interpersonal relationships to water that Indigenous peoples tend to have, has also impacted water security overall. For example, Indigenous peoples in Canada do not see water as a commodity or simply a resource. Water is viewed as a gift, which requires respect. And within my own culture, we understand that when we have access to both water quality and quantity, we have this because our ancestors did not take more than they needed and conserved water so that present generations can enjoy the same access to water that they did. In addition, we also understand that we have a responsibility to our present and future generations to do the same thing for them, which is respecting conserving water so that they would also have the same access to water that we do now. And in our article, we concluded by discussing the need to decolonize water relationships and navigate settler colonial legal systems and tools in a way that strategically assert Indigenous understandings of sovereignty, as well as inherent rights and responsibilities to water. In addition, we believe that community-led efforts are equal assertions of sovereignty, and that these are also fundamental to achieving water security for Indigenous peoples. And I'll let Nicole go next, or follow up.
Thanks so much. So I'm a co-author with Rachel on this paper on Indigenous water security, and I'm an assistant professor and a Canada Research Chair in Arctic Environmental Change and Governance at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada, which is situated on Treaty 1 territory. I'm a non-Indigenous person or a person of settler origin, and it was my pleasure to be able to collaborate with Andrew Curley, Teresa Montoya, and Rachel Arsenault, three sort of leading Indigenous scholars in Canada and the US, to write this paper. And really to look at this idea that often Indigenous peoples are grouped in with other racialized people in the literature on water insecurity, when actually many of the water insecurities faced by Indigenous people are actually produced by a particular set of political circumstances created by settler colonialism. So I think Rachel really summed up the paper, so I won't say any more on that, but thank you so much for having me here today.
And that is on to me, correct, Dr. Gina? Thanks. Hi, everyone. And yes, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. So my name is Suya Romano. I'm an associate professor of political science and global studies at Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So my paper has two co-authors, Jamie Nelson Nunez at the University of New Mexico and Thomas Lavanchi from Oklahoma State, who is in the room with us right now. The title of our article in the special issue is Rural Water Provision at the State-Society Interface in Latin America. And in the paper, we focus on 3 Central American countries, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. So I wanted to use this time to highlight 3 interconnected findings to start that are important for understanding water insecurity. So the first is that rural drinking water sectors in Latin America diverge in significant ways from their urban counterparts. One really quick example of how. And this is that residents in rural areas are, by and large, the drinking water service providers. They work in small committees, primarily on a volunteer basis, in the communities in which they live, and they serve over 71 million rural residents in the region. This contrasts with the predominant water provision model in urban areas, which depends upon technical experts and trained professionals working as employees of public or private water companies. So one implication of sectoral differences is that they compel a different relationship to the state and state policy to ensure greater water security for residents. A second finding, starting in the 1990s, national level associations of rural water service providers began to form as a way to address sector weaknesses. And these weaknesses included issues of perceived political exclusion. 3, is that the predominant and recent state approach in Latin America to the rural water sector has been to formally recognize the role of rural residents in water provision. This has been accomplished through new legal frameworks that seek to clarify regulatory relationships and provide greater organizational and financial support to rural water managers and supply systems. And I want to say more later about our assessment of these policies. But I'll share now that these have been influenced by the organizing and advocacy of national water associations, who are not only demanding recognition and support as service providers, but also inclusion in water policy making. And one way to frame this advocacy, including calls for inclusion, is to see it as not just the pursuit of water security, but the pursuit of water justice in terms of who is designing and implementing policy. Thank you.
I think this is my turn now. Good morning or good evening, depending where you are. My name is Suya Kingsley. I'm a lecturer at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And first, I'd like to thank Dr. Georgina Drill for inviting me to this webinar, and also thank the editors of the special issue of Water International about water insecurity in the state. This topic is especially important to me because I teach in a public administration undergrad course, and I'm part of the postgraduate program in urban and regional planning. My research focuses on the inequalities related to the access to water and sanitation in the metropolitan area of Rio de Janeiro, which has faced water shortages since the very foundation of the city in 1565. In the special issue, I wrote with two other researchers, Bruno Puga from Brazil and Tanti Octavianti from Indonesia. She's now at the University of West England in Bristol. And we wrote the paper, Mobilization of Bias, Learning from Drought and Flood Crisis in São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Jakarta. We analyzed the water crisis and the solutions proposed by the public administration in these three megacities in the global south. And in all the cases, the water crises were understood as quantitative problems, scarcity in the case of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, and too much water, too much rain causing floods in Jakarta. In these three cases, crisis frame induced public policy solutions focused on building large infrastructures, mostly supply-side solutions in Brazil, represented either by the Guapiaçu Dam and by a big water treatment plant in Rio de Janeiro, either by a water transfer or a river diversion in São Paulo, and in the case of Jakarta, the 32 kilometers of offshore seawall to deal with rising sea levels. But weather is only part of the problem, and this is the starting point of our argument. The main reasons for scarcity in southeastern Brazil, which are water pollution, environmental degradation, lack of infrastructure in urban periphery, and the cause of floods in Jakarta, land subsidies due to the overexploitation of groundwater, were rarely addressed or became an object of public policy. It's in this sense, we argue that by failing to address the three cities' key water problems, none of the solutions, these engineering works, actually improved households' water security, which are our team here in this section in Sweden. I think this now is Thomas.
Hey, thank you. My name is Thomas Lavanchi. I'm an assistant professor in geography here at Oklahoma State University in the United States. I am a human environment interaction geographer with background mostly in the physical sciences. I initially got into the policy world with Sarah Romano doing some work in Nicaragua probably a decade or so ago. But I'm happy to be here. I just want to say thank you to Amber and Wendy for their work to coordinate the special issue, and to Georgina for this webinar. I also want to recognize my colleagues who helped me with this research, Dr. Michael Kerwin and PhD candidate Megan McCarroll, who are both at the University of Denver. Our paper was based on research that we did in a Black township in Cape Town, South Africa, following the 2018 Day Zero drought event. So the actual drought itself was about a 300-year event that happened between 2015 and 2017. And then in 2018, this Day Zero event, which was really when all the taps across the city of 4 million people were going to be shut off, and people would have to queue up to get a basic amount of water per day. Our interest was knowing in looking at this sort of uniform drought experience, what did that look like for different demographics of people? So we did 500 stratified, randomly sampled surveys in 2019. With the idea that all citizens across Cape Town would have experienced water insecurity, but we wanted to know, was that an even experience? And of course, it was not. In many ways, I think a good comparison is to think about when this current COVID pandemic came out, a lot of people talked about it sort of being an equalizer in a uniform experience. And right away, we realized that even though it occurred around the world, it did not have a uniform expression. And we found the same thing with the Day Zero and water insecurity there. So Cape Town historically has experienced periodic drought. They're accustomed to managing the demand for water and decreased demand for water. However, they have continually relied upon surface water, despite the advice of experts. They have not diversified their portfolio of water with groundwater desalination and water reuse. And so what that meant is with this drought is that they were not prepared for that. And what our article does is to parse out the implications of a climate shock event in a place, in a country that has very progressive policies and laws on access to water. So on paper, it looks great. But with our article, we took a deeper look at how the city of Cape Town used cost recovery mechanism. In other words, how they generated revenue to cover a free basic water allotment for people, and what that happened, what that looked like under this climate shock when that revenue was eroded. As I mentioned during this event in Cape Town, which has about 4 million people, the city rolled out demand management, and that looked like aggressive messaging, water pressure reduction, water management devices, things like that. What ended up happening was a very uneven landscape was sort of revealed for what it was. And those who had means to do so could drill wells, could buy water, could do other things. And those without those means were left on the side. And so what really we were doing is trying to look at how, despite a sort of very progressive stance on access to water, the unpreparedness of the state, and even the economic mechanism that they were using to cover their free basic water was revealed as inadequate. And so a lot of the surveys that we did were portions of the questions were directed at then what should the city or what should the state's role be in understanding the everyday lived experiences of people in this sort of drought event. So a lot of the results, which I can speak to later as we talk about other things, were revealed in that paper. Thanks.
So I think this is my turn, the last one. So hello, everybody. My name is Vanessa Pinocchi. I'm an assistant professor at the Federal University of ABC in São Paulo, Brazil, in the field of territorial planning. And I developed my research from the critical perspective of political ecology, and I have been looking at water insecurity in marginalized settings, hydrosocial territories, and territorial planning. So thank you so much, Georgina, for putting together this seminar and giving us the opportunity to reflect as a group on the special issue that we put together. Like Professor Amber already kindly introduced this special issue, we decided to join the articles and another special issue for Water International that we were organizing together with Professor Wendy Jepson, that came after a seminar that we organized in Brazil in 2019 on urban water security, from infrastructure to social action. So from this workshop that we have young scholars, junior scholars from the UK and Brazilian universities, we were able to put together this viewpoint article that I'm going to present to you today, but also other two articles that are part of this special issue. So because they were dialoguing so well with the title and the theme of the special issue, that it worked super well, and we had an experience to even create more opportunities to reflect on water insecurity. So the paper that I'm presenting today, it's called Advancing Urban Water Security, the Urbanization of Water Society Relations and Entry Points for Political Engagement. And this is a multi-authors article, and it's a viewpoint article. So I'm the lead author, but also there are 21 co-authors. So it was an amazing experience to put together this piece, because it represents the discussions that we developed during the 1 week workshop that we hosted in Brazil, and it was funded by FAPESP and the British Council. So the main point that I would like to bring as a contribution from this paper is that we our goal was to advance a critical and relational concept of urban water security. So what does it mean? It means that for us, water security is produced by hydrosocial dynamics in urban processes. And it takes place in multiple scales and dimensions. So the fact that we call urban water security and urban water insecurity, the urban aspect is not just the context where water security or insecurity is taking place, but it's part of the construction and the production of urban water security. So I think this is the main point that we had in our article, understanding the specificities of urban processes that are taking place and how they produce by hydrosocial dynamics water insecurity. And when we talk about urban processes, we are talking about political economic processes that also produces inequalities. So this is the turning point that we would like to bring through this paper. And then we also introduce, and I will develop further during our discussion, 5 entry points where we understand that it's key to help us to understand water insecurity, but also offers opportunities for transformation and change. So this is what I have for now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you to all the authors who presented their short blurbs or overviews on their presentations. That was wonderful to see them all in one place in that condensed format, because I think it really helps to link up a lot of the connections in a very visceral way. And we're going to discuss some of those moving forward. I'm struck by how important scalar hierarchies are in many of these papers, class, status, elite nature, whether it's, including race, ethnicity. In my own paper for the special issue, caste came into play. We have Indigenous issues versus settler colonial ways of seeing the landscape and water resource management. Lots of social and cultural, and indeed, as Vanessa said, the hydrosocial is involved in needing to understand how all of these things are coming together to shape and inform water insecurity, as well as the overall role of the economy and neoliberalism. So I think that was also an important interjection. I think there were already some nods towards what's going wrong. So this will probably be the shorter part of the discussion. Maybe you can all surprise me, but why don't we have a moment to collectively discuss, and anyone can jump in at any time. You can all turn on your mics. If there's noise in the background, we'll forgive it for now for the purpose of the roundtable discussion. But I'm going to challenge you all to talk about what councils, municipalities, and states are potentially getting right. So where are the successes, if any? Where can we see that some things have moved in the right direction or are moving in the right direction?
Thanks, Georgina. I like how we're starting on a sort of a positive stance. There'll be, I think, plenty to talk about otherwise. I like too how you gave the broad cross-section of how all these fit into the same sort of discussion, and which is really good. I think, as with my experience in South Africa, what's going right, at least, anytime one thinks about water security and even resources in general in South Africa, I think one is immediately reminded that the conversation of justice in South Africa goes back to what happened in 1994 at the end of this very long period of apartheid, where winners and losers were definitely codified in the law of what you could and couldn't do. And so in 1994, when Nelson Mandela and the ANC took over, there was really this, okay, how do we put into law this priority that certain things should be available to all people? And water, the human right to water was put right there in the Constitution. About 6 years after that, there was actually this thing called free basic water, where every citizen was guaranteed 50 liters or 25 liters per person per day. And so that's a very progressive stance. The bridge then to where things have gone wrong is that is left up, that is in the national law, but it's left up to local municipalities to figure out how to implement that. And that's where we found out in our study. That's sort of like, hey, this great idea, which looks good and looks like a great pendulum swing in South Africa, has come up against lack of success in some situations. And so but what they're getting right is that it's great, it's there in the law, there's something to argue against and to leverage. But then what happens in our case in a climate shock and some other things.
Thanks, Thomas. I just want to point out that was also a really good nod towards the latter part of the discussion, which we're not quite there yet, but the ways in which some of these successes are tied to policy infrastructure. And, in your case, you're pointing out how the legal framework has been at least trying to move things in a way that would ameliorate some of these issues. Anyone else? Some successes, points of praise?
I have something to say. So I think missing from the list of governments that you had is Indigenous governments. And sometimes we forget that these are a level of government. And so when I think about successes related to Indigenous peoples and water insecurity, I don't think about the state. But I do think we have a responsibility to move away from this sort of damage-based approach to think about the positives. So I see, and through our paper, we explore the ways that tribes and First Nations in Canada and the US are asserting their self-determination and, developing approaches to addressing water insecurity through their own relationships to water. So ranging from a variety of approaches, including developing their own community-based water monitoring programs. There's a lot of work, for example, centering on revitalizing Indigenous legal traditions and legal orders. Just to focus on the positive things that are happening. Those are some of the things I would mention. So,
yeah. Thank you. I think that was another important intervention in terms of reminding us of who, different regulatory agencies or governing management agencies, what they look like, including at the Indigenous or First Nations level. And saying that I do come, I'm speaking from the Ghana country in South Australia, who are the traditional custodians of Australia, of this part of Australia. But when you were speaking as well, Nicole, I just wanted I'm writing a different paper on something else, and I'm digging into Stretton Institute's work. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that last name, as I mispronounced so many of yours, including surprisingly Melissa's and Amber's. So go think. I never would have imagined that I'd get that wrong. But what Estrida writes is that our watery imaginaries directly impact how we treat water. And she's quoting Linton and his idea around modern water. So in saying this, she's not trying to discredit Indigenous or First Nations perspectives around water. She's critiquing our mainstream frameworks. So let me begin again. Our watery imaginaries directly impact how we treat water, including how we think it should serve us limitlessly, in parentheses, and what we think we can make it do, parentheses, anything we need. Right. But the idea is it really does matter what's in our head, what's in our hearts, how we're thinking about water. And that changes how water's managed. And that can have strong repercussions for whether it's collective water sharing or whether it's water inequalities that result in extreme insecurity in some regions as opposed to others.
I can make a comment. So like Nicole, I'll take the spotlight a little bit off national states in Latin America, and I think this pertains to the ways in which we're looking at rural water sectors. We don't use this language of parallel state in the paper, but we're really looking at regimes that are resident led. These are instances of civil society doing work of water management. We do give a nod to the increasing state attention in terms of public policy and new legal frameworks as positive for the rural water sector, but it's really out of the shortcomings of the policies, what they're omitting in practice, what they're not paying attention to, the ways they're not being implemented, that leads me to want to bring an example of success from the local and really trans community level, which are these cases of horizontal networks, nationally, regionally, municipal level, and even transnationally in Latin America that are convening rural water committees across the regions. And a lot of them are doing the work of building capacities for more sustainable water management, and they're also engaging in the political work of building capacities for greater inclusion in making water policy. So just to give a nod to, you know, some of the work that rural water committee members are doing is making up for, you know, continuing to make up for some of the shortcomings of policies, right, that continue to be passed.
Yeah, I think that's important. Oh, Vanessa has something to say. I just want to say as well, in our piece on water insecurity in Bangalore, we had something very similar to what Sarah and Nicole are pointing out, that kind of, that when you look at the extreme, the micro level water management, there's a lot going right. But then upscaling that is a different challenge and a different issue. Vanessa.
Yeah, I just would like to add that one good thing is that water insecurity and water security is part of the agenda of the state. This is one thing. But then the other thing is how this concept or this discourse is understood, and what are the tools that create and the solutions that are proposed. So water security and insecurity is at the state agenda and the spaces for discussion and decision making, but it's strictly related to infrastructure. So, so then I stop here, because then I start the critical view that I'm waiting to bring later.
I think lots of people are waiting to jump into that critical view. Maybe do we have one more point of praise for something that's going right somewhere, anywhere, and then we'll move on to the more cautionary notes around how things could be done better, particularly at the level of infrastructure and policy infrastructure?
I can jump
Can
in
I?
one more. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, that's okay. I'm glad to hear that good things are having been done in various parts of the world, but unfortunately, it's very hard to identify anything the Brazilian government is doing right at this moment. I think we are doing it all wrong, and imagine the news about Brazil, wherever you are not very encouraging now. In 2020, the federal government passed a law which encourages the privatization of water and sanitation services, which can be very problematic in my point of view from a water security perspective. And currently in Rio de Janeiro, actually the main response of the government of the states to the water and sanitation problems is the privatization of the state-owned company, which is named SEDAI. And they expect this will increase investment, but we are very cautious about that. I think this is not very encouraging news from Brazil, but I hope this will change in the next 2 years.
Amber?
Yeah, briefly, with regard to the paper that Melissa is representing, but I co-authored, and she also co-authored the paper I'm representing. A bright spot is that the city of Phoenix's municipal water delivery really is very valuable, and that's why it's a resource that's up for capture, right? So I think it's important to acknowledge that, and also that they've been quite successful in implementing a water equity plan that ensures that lower income and marginalized residents are receiving high quality and consistent water service. So of course, the focus of the paper is on the discursive capture of that, but there has to be a valuable resource there to capture.
I'll just jump into, I'm actually the paper that I'm representing today, right, took place in Arizona, but my field site that I'm working on right now is actually in California. And similar to Thomas, California is one of the first states in the US to recognize the human right to water. So there's very similar parallels. And I did field work in South Africa as well. So there's very similar parallels to what Thomas is mentioning about South Africa and California. And recognizing that human right to water is a huge step. And the other pretty amazing thing that California is doing. And I just got off a call literally 2 hours ago with a member of the state water board who was telling me about their emergency programs to get water, that the state is funding emergency programs to get water to communities whose wells are running dry. And they're spending $800,000 like monthly to get bottled water and hauled water to communities where those are running dry. They feel though, they're like, it's just like money pouring out because the governance has devolved down to the municipality, but then the state is trying to play catch up on the back end to try to ensure this right. And so it's just this like constantly running sieve basically. So the intentions are there, there's good things, and then we can get to the critical aspects too.
Well, I think we're on that point of needing to jump into the critical aspects, but it's good that you clarified how difficult it is to enact the right to water, Melissa, because that's what was in my mind. I'm sitting in a part of the world that also really relies on their freshwater supply being directed from other states, river water from other states, the Murray River water we get the tail end of it in South Australia. And a lot of that is what we survive off of and our agriculture survives off of, which is part of a project that I'm working on right now. But right, we can recognize the human right to water, we can have strong water rights frameworks. Does that necessarily help us with water insecurity when our systems aren't necessarily geared towards balanced distribution and sustainable use and regeneration of water supplies? So that's the bigger question. So let's jump into the critical components. And so let's if people who are in the audience want to pipe in with comments and questions as well, they're welcome to. But let's really talk about how the successes and failures of addressing water insecurity. And I think at this point, we're really just talking about the failures. How can they inform local, regional, and state policy infrastructures? And by state, I mean the state. Although you could perhaps bring an example in of a California or an Arizona as well. So how do we take these lessons that we learned from all these different parts of the world, which are nuanced, they're ground level, but they also take into consideration the role of the economy, the role of persistent inequality, of racism, of classism and casteism. How do we then translate that to getting better systems and infrastructures?
I could start with a brief comment here. Sorry, I'll make it brief. So one of the things that we turn to in our paper in regards to the shortcomings of state policy, and these include, ineffective implementation of the laws, not having sufficient funding to carry out, some of the new government charges in relation to the rural water sector, inadequate addressing of climate change and the immediate and impending impacts on rural communities and their water supply systems. One of the things that we suggest is a different kind of engagement and relationship to water committee governance networks that are doing a lot of the on-the-ground work, incorporating them more as political actors, taking them on as partners, facilitating funding streams to them, provisioning meeting spaces and other resources, conducting state mapping exercises that can support the work that these networks themselves are doing. So I guess in a nutshell, a way to sum this up is that, for the rural sector in particular, I think when residents themselves are the volunteer water managers, they really should be intimately involved in crafting and implementing water policy. And they're really calling to be at the table to do that. So I think we're not going to get very far with policymakers sitting in their offices or in the hall debating the policy. These are actors that have to be brought to the table.
So I would just quickly say the Puerto Rico case is an important one because, people around the world may not realize that Puerto Rico is an active current colony of the United States with no representation in the United States federal government. And so this is, and given Puerto Rico's exposure and expected vulnerability to climate change and related disasters, the lack of federal response around Puerto Rico's needs is particularly severe. So I think this is a really poignant and important case that helps us think through decolonization and what would be needed in the future.
I think one of the things, we'll speak to like the Canadian case study that Rachel had mentioned. We're talking about the First Nations drinking water crisis in Canada. And I think one of the key pieces, there's sort of regulatory and jurisdictional issues in Canada that really do shape the First Nations drinking water crisis. And while the federal government, is saying that they're investing all kinds of money in infrastructure and has several times given a deadline for when they will address the First Nations water crisis. I'm not sure, I haven't looked at it recently, but it has not been resolved. We'll just say that. But one of the things when you look at the actual legal and jurisdictional arrangements in Canada, the Canadian Constitution was developed with the assumption that Indigenous peoples do not have water rights. It divided jurisdiction essentially between the federal government and then provincial and territorial governments, and then they delegate some authorities to municipal governments, but nowhere in there were Indigenous governments. And as we know, Indigenous peoples have inherent water rights and authority, and you can't just unilaterally erase those because you develop the Canadian Constitution. So I think addressing that fundamental piece around acknowledging First Nation water rights in Canada is a key piece to a key legal piece that needs to be addressed to address kind of root causes related to the drinking water crisis. So thanks.
In the case of art research in Cape Town, this relates to what Amber and Sarah were saying about representation and a voice at the table. So despite progressive water laws and the intent to make sure everyone has access to free basic water, the way that the city of Cape Town pays for free basic water is that block tariff, where those higher end users, sort of what Gina Zergoval at University of Cape Town says, is sort of a Robin Hood approach, where you take money, revenue from that top, and you forward it here. But in a climate shock event where you want everyone to drop their consumption, suddenly that revenue disappears. And so then the local state, as in Cape Town, is forced to say, how do we balance our budget? And so then they want to put water management devices on homes to sort of dole out that free basic amount, and then beyond which there's no water going through. But the lack of understanding of what it looks like in a township where there's not this uniform 8 people per resident, and so we can dole this out. And so there's a really disconnect between understanding what do people's everyday experiences look like in various housing types in a township. So getting access and getting a voice at the table to sort of describe, hey, this is the way our lives look. How do we make a claim against this policy that says we deserve free basic water when your mechanisms don't really acknowledge or realize what our lives are like here on the ground? So that voice and representation really is at the heart of the failure, at least in the Cape Town Day Zero event. Yeah,
great comments and points of reminder from other things we've talked about as well. Thanks, Thomas. I also want to bring up something that Masum Hamdard has written in the Q&A here, because I think it overlaps as well. He reminds us, I think they remind us that in many developing countries, you have informal settlements or slums. They're being deprived from drinking water network, as owning a water meter is linked to the recognition or ownership of the property. This often leads to water stealing or poor quality of water, resulting to heavy health costs. So I think that there's a lot of times municipalities and states get upset when they see theft or they see things that they think are infringements on the legal frameworks around water. which is really, in a sense, victim blaming. They push people to the end of desperation, and when they act to survive out of desperation, then oftentimes there's punishment rather than collaborative efforts to address the issue. And I won't get into it, but we kind of had some similar insights looking at low-income settlements on the outskirts of peri-urban Bangalore. Just, people who are very poor, rural migrants to Bangalore, who are basically what we say, they're involved in patchwork adaptability every single day to try to source water from any variety, any number of different locations each day to make ends meet. And this has not just a health cost in terms of stress, it also has an economic cost in terms of people needing to be at home waiting for water, so that a lot of women don't get to use that time to engage in cash earning labor that would then help them perhaps invest and save money, or invest in their children's education in a better way. And then there's a health cost as well in terms of, if you get poor quality water, then you're sick as well. And so I think states are, in the Bangalore case of the state has basically decided to, in many of these off-grid pop-up urban settlements that are informal but not quite slums, they are paying private water tankers to kind of patch some of the water supply. So, it's not necessarily an official public-private partnership, but in effect, they're basically channeling state income through to private water companies who, have been called water mafias. And then, so those are the beneficiaries. The water tanker industry is kind of the beneficiary of this uneven, imbalanced way of doing urban planning. So the problem becomes, for a case like that, well, it's very easy to sit, I'm in South Australia, I'm a white settler origin, and it's easy for me to critique and say, well, they should have done better planning in a place like Bangalore. But across all of the developing world, I mean, the population growth, breakneck level of development means that, lots of municipalities and states are just trying to catch up with the demand that people are putting into the system. And so it is often very difficult to try to make that policy intervention, to say they should have thought about things ahead of time and should have found money for investment ahead of time. So trying to figure out what they can do now is a very sensitive issue, but also I think we have many reminders from the panelists that step one might be to work more with people who are on the ground dealing with those levels of daily struggle around water access and water security. So we are at the 1 hour mark. I would just maybe ask if we wanted to go 5 minutes more, are there any pressing points of concern or commentary that anyone wants to raise based on this final question around informing local, regional, and state policy infrastructures based on our either individual or collective knowledge around water insecurity and how it manifests?
I would like to make a few comments, and based on the questions that we received from the audience and also your reflection. In our paper, once we understand that urban water security is produced by urban processes, we also understand that water insecurity is not separate from other issues and rights in the city. So we cannot talk about water insecurity if we don't talk about housing, if we don't talk about land tenure, if we don't talk about a health access to health, to jobs, the types of jobs and labor. So thinking on that, we propose on our paper 5 entry points where they could help us to understand how urban water insecurity is produced and also promote change. So one of them is territory, and understanding that we are talking about flows of power and disputes. And when we talk about territories, we are talking about spaces of struggle and resistance. So this is key for us when we talk about urban water insecurity. Also, labor relations and citizens' rights to the city. So informal and precarious work, land tenure, and water rights, how are these connected? And how, for example, access to infrastructure also depends on land tenure and housing. And we are talking a lot about the areas that are more vulnerable in the city. and infrastructure, that inequality leads to off-grid infrastructure and the need to consider the population beyond those connected to formal services. And I think this was a point that came out in many papers of this special issue. Governance is key to recognize that unequal power relations in urban water governance are present in the structures and the processes of governance. Even though these institutions were created based on participatory spaces of negotiation, inequality is there because it reproduces the power relations that were already in place. So to break this, it's key. And also, finally, the importance of social action. So go beyond the idea of participation in the spaces of negotiation practices, but look at how to produce and co-produce solutions based on different types of knowledge and praxis. So it's not just a matter of participating in the decision-making, but it's creating the solutions, different solutions, understanding the diversities of people involved in the conditions and are living under conditions of water insecurity. Yeah.
Incredibly well put. There's nothing I could say to top that. That was succinct, articulate, and I think a wonderful way to round out the discussion because we are at time. But it also does remind me, Masoom had asked, and I'm sure other people who have tuned in are wondering where to find these readings, the articles, because you can go and look up more of the papers and see more of the fine level detail, including some of the policy insights and implications. So I don't know if the link that I tried to share in the chat box worked for the general audience, but it is volume 46 of Water Insecurity, and it's issue 6. And I'm sure that where and when copyright allows it to be so, if you can't get access to one of those readings, I would imagine that you could email one of the authors and they would be happy to share a version for your personal use, which I think is copyright. It's allowed within copyright, I think, sharing person-to-person articles. So thank you so much, everyone who's joined us today. Thank you, the audience members. Thank you to the Stretton Institute for hosting this webinar as a platform. And thank you to the members of HWISE, who I know have also tuned in. Wendy Jepson might have been here for some of the conversation. You can also look up the Stretton Institute website for more details on future events. HWISE has a plethora of different events, webinars, workshops, and community engagement opportunities, including the ability to self-nominate as a member to be more involved with HWISE as opportunities arise. And then finally, I just want to thank everyone who's here in the main panel. I'm not going to embarrass myself twice or thrice by saying your last name, so I will say in order of appearance, thank you very much, Amber, Melissa, Nicole, Rachel, Sarah, Suya, Thomas, and Vanessa. I learned a lot, and I feel I've got some wind in my sails from the conversation today. Even though it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, there's some glimmers of hope, and at least looking at where the conversations moved, and looking at how people collectively are looking at things in a very systematic way, but also making that call that we have to include people who are struggling the most with water insecurity at whatever table we're talking about, council level, municipal, state, etc. All right, with that, I will conclude the webinar, and I wish you all a great evening or day or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Bye.